We would like to thank Her Excellency, the Honorable Ovina Topsy-Sono, the Commissioner at the African Commission on Human Rights and People's Rights. She is also the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa, who was meant to join us online, but unfortunately, due to a technical glitch, she's unable to join us, but she was really, really eager to be part of the discussions and the conversation today. I would like for us to give her a round of applause and accept her apologies for not being able to make it. Let's give her a round of applause. I don't want to waste any time. Special Rapporteur Irene Khan, I'm going to start off with you. And I want to start off with you on this question about how can due process of law for content restriction be ensured at scale? Should illegal content be treated by digital platforms in the same way as legal but harmful content, that seriously impacts societies? Should they be treated as illegal or legal but harmful content?
Okay, like others before me on the platform, maybe I'm not going to answer your question exactly as you've put it to me. Well, I think before we move to content moderation, I think it's, and especially when you're talking about law, I think it's important to recognize there are a few questions to ask. What are we talking about here? When you think about law and human rights law, I think there are issues of content curation policies that have an impact on content moderation. As we heard Maria Ressa speak this morning, it's a polluted river, and to take the pollution out cup by cup, rather than talking about what's happening at the beginning, has an impact there. The question I would ask is, when we're talking about content moderation, what are we really talking about? Whose responsibility, whose obligation, what standards? And we've seen that there is actually content moderation taking place in different ways. Yeah. One is by state interference in the system of regulation. States are setting out laws that restrict what we can say. I heard in the earlier session this whole issue about where we need to have standards, where we need to have freedom. Freedom, the main starting point has to be with freedom of expression, that there is free flow of information on the internet. A safe, free internet is extremely important. And content moderation has to be part of creating a safe and free internet. Which means that when you are talking about how do we make it safe and free, then we have to think about freedom of opinion and expression. We don't usually focus on opinion, but our opinion is actually being more affected. It's an absolute right. We all have the right to think what we want in our heads. And that is where platforms are actually affecting our ability, and that goes to content curation, what you see, first of all. And then, how do you moderate what you have seen out there? How do you moderate that to take out what is unlawful, as you said, and what is harmful but not unlawful? That's a very, very difficult division, because what is unlawful... Yeah, what is unlawful, yes, international law says freedom of expression can only be restricted under certain conditions. That is, in order to protect some legitimate objectives, like your reputation, your right, public health, public security, public order, and so on. So there are very limited grounds there. And it has to be done lawfully through means that are necessary and proportionate. Hate speech, incitement to violence, can be prohibited, but again, on certain grounds, and the standard of what is incitement is very high. So yes, you can restrict certain content, but the presumption is in favor of free flow of information.
How do we determine that? In terms of these guidelines, how are we going to be able to determine that? What is incitement of violence? What is construed as hate speech? the definitions at times become too lengthy, they become watered down. How does one then be able to determine that?
Exactly, you have to be very concrete. I think when you look at the guidelines that we are talking about, the draft that's going out, it's talking about, I think it's talking about harm to democracy.
Yes.
What is democracy? You know, you ask the range of governments, they will all give you a definition of democracy from China to the United States in a very different way. So we've got to be very careful about what terms we are using. You're absolutely right there. And when we are then asking who regulates governments, very dangerous. I'm sorry to say that, very dangerous to leave governments to regulate content, because the tendency will be a lot of censorship. We've seen that happening with a lot of laws, where governments are trying to regulate content that affects the sentiment of religious groups. Now define, I offend some religious group and I will be stopped. Or affects, is offensive to the image of senior officials, political leaders. Those are not legitimate grounds under international law. So we have to be very careful. On the other hand, you're handing over to companies, to private entities, commercially driven motives to regulate what they believe is harmful. That is also equally dangerous. And that is why one has to come back to international human rights standards and to the elaboration of these standards that has actually taken place in the UN system, in other international bodies, where there are very clear standards set out as to how you identify hate speech. So you have to dig deeper into that, but the starting point with companies has to be that they adhere to human rights standards and not to their own company policies. Most of them, except for Meta, don't have a human rights policy. Most of them are applying their own company policies, and even with Meta's human rights policies, we've heard a lot about the problems there. All
right, Ms. Ribeiro, I want to hear your response on this question, because this is a very important question, and I want to hear your response on this question on how can due processes of law for content restriction be ensured at scale. How are we, in your view, how are we going to do that?
Thank you very much for this question. But, you know, to intervene at this point in time in this conference, it's a kind of a curse and a blessing. Everything, almost everything has already been said, which is an advantage, but that, so let me take a step back and say maybe what we should discuss, it's not just about removing content illegal or harmful, but maybe the exercise we should do is and again, I go back to what the ADG said in the morning, why should we intervene, what to do, and how to do. And these are the three main questions for us, in a way, to guide our actions regarding the digital space and regarding the achievement, which I think it's a shared goal of us all, the achievement of an healthy information space. We are now, nowadays, very far away from the ideal public sphere of Habermas. And how can we, in a way, have, again, a shared space that is so important for our public life, for our democracies, which was precisely what Maria Ressa said in the morning. Yeah. If we don't have this shared space, how can we live in a community, in a society? So I would say that for me, why should we? It's clear. We need an healthy information space. What we need to really understand who are the stakeholders, that should intervene in this process, and we know that it's a multi-stakeholder approach, definitely it is, but what are the responsibilities assigned to each other? And this is what is maybe the more difficult issue. What is the responsibility of the states? What is the responsibility of the platforms? What is the responsibility of the society as a whole, etc.? And I would like to start by the states, because this is important and we need really to be very clear. The states have an obligation not only to respect human rights, but to enforce human rights. So
my question to you is,
I know,
who should be the driver of these guidelines to ensure that regulations comes into play? Who should drive this process that at the end of the day, somebody, somewhere, whoever needs to, takes up the baton and then ensure that there's regulations in place?
Governments, because they are the ones that should enforce human rights. And if we think that the information space in which we are living now are really damaging some of our values that are the basis of human rights, then it's up to the governments to take the decision. Then the way it will be implemented, this is another question. It doesn't mean that all the burden is on the shoulders of the governments, but there is a kind of a shared responsibilities for the different stakeholders according to their responsibilities.
All right.
According to their, so it means that the states, the platforms, etc. I also would like to come to a question related to co-regulation. What is co-regulation indeed? Because I heard but co-regulation could in a way reinforce the power of the platforms. The way I see co-regulation, slightly different one. It's up to the states to say, okay, to achieve some goals, we need to do this, this, and this. And to assign to the platforms what they should know. And if they are not able to ensure that they will comply with some goals that were defined democratically based on international human rights, then yes, the government can intervene and regulate. So I would say that this is a kind of a negotiation between the platforms and the governments, but it's not to give more power to the governments or more power to the platforms. No, it's a shared responsibility, and it's important that each one of the stakeholders really complies with the
I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to come back to you, especially on that. There's a specific question lingering at the back of my mind, yeah. But I want to go quickly to Special Rapporteur Villarreal. I want to ask this question, though. What safeguards would be put in place to ensure that the guidelines are not abused in ways that limit freedom of expression and access to information?
First of all, let me start by thanking this space. Freedom of expression community used to say that controversy, deliberation, and discussion is good for, better decisions and decision making. So what I can contribute to this, to your question, is the InterAmerican approach, which we have different legal international frame. And also I think one of the challenges for your question is how do we contribute and how the regional mechanisms are reflected in a global initiative. So that's why I would like, by saying like the good things of these guidelines. We recognize that it moves forward the guarantees of review and justification in content moderation decisions. We think that it's also right, the approach to the availability of mechanisms to appeal in local languages. and also that encourages human rights risk assessment through external audits. But now let me go into the Inter-American approach, what I think is the added value that my office could contribute to this conversation. The Inter-American system has adopted an international human rights law understanding in which more information, counter-speech, pluralism, and education should be the answer to the deterioration of the public debate. It's more than content moderation. We have our democracies deteriorated in the public sphere. And we truly believe that any platform regulation model must be guided by human rights. And I think that's kind of a consensus. We have privileged the approach based both on digital literacy to create conditions for critical interaction with the public space and on the reaffirmation of freedom of expression of ordinary citizens on the internet as opposed to the differential position, and I would say the differential responsibility that speeches of public officials or public servants, political leaders, assume in the digital public sphere. To make it clear in one sentence, we cannot pretend to have a peaceful digital conversation if our political leaders are consciously disseminating disinformation and hate speech. And that's something that it's not a digital challenge. It's the behavior of our leaders. And I take the opportunity, we have state delegations here that to analyze the scope of the complexity of this content. Then you've asked before around, probably is the most controversial phrase in this guide, and I'm going to quote it. It says,
Please go ahead.
One of the aims of the guidelines is to support regulatory process against, and I quote, content that risks significantly damaging democracy and the enjoyment of human rights, quote. Okay, this term seems to refer in the guidelines to hate speech, disinformation, and misinformation, and seems to prioritize approaches based on limiting them somehow. We consider, in our office, we consider that this proposal could end up undermining and even lowering the line of protection of lawful expressions in the name of credible and reliable information ecosystem. We have to be very cautious with this framework because it can allow speeches that are not prosecuted by state authorities to be prosecuted by private actors. If democratic institutions are not authorized to restrict certain content, why should companies that do not exercise strictly democratic functions be allowed to? And I leave this question here. I want to highlight, as the representative of the Inter-American system of human rights, that these guidelines will be one of the most important references for the regulation of content moderation for now. And in the Americas, 35 countries, I am not sure that all countries have the same level of democratic stability and institutional capacity as in other regions to interpret guidelines in a way that guarantees free speech or to adopt the same understanding as UNESCO is doing now. It is worth to question what type of legislative behavior the framework is supporting, because in some countries, let's say strong countries, the guidelines could have one effect, and in weak democracies, the same guideline could have another effect. And I'm just going to wrap up with an example.
Okay.
I am in a region where legislative reforms allow arbitrarily deprive a person of citizenship based on justifications such as treason against homeland. And in some cases, it's because a simple retweet. what would be interpreted as a content that risks significantly damaging democracy and the enjoyment of human rights in this specific context? And also, not only government, judiciary and parliament could be involved in this specific country that I'm putting here as an example. So I'll go back to that controversy, deliberation, and discussion is good. And one of the indirect results that I expect from this conversation is that we, as freedom of expression advocates, could contribute to a better comprehension of the challenges of content moderation. It's not only the regulation, it's also the behavior of our leaders.
Okay, before we get to the floor, and I would like to hear what everybody's views are on this specific discussion that we are having. Special Rapporteur Khan, I want to ask this question because it was raised earlier, and that question was the powers. And I think that's also what Special Rapporteur Villarreal mentions, is how would these guidelines, and I've asked that, in terms of that, how would these guidelines be interpreted? How would they be implemented into regulations in different countries? But my question is really, who's going to drive that process to ensure that states, tech companies, everybody else that needs to come up with some form of regulation, regulates? Just a quick one. Who's going to drive that process? Is it going to be the UN? Through UNESCO? Who's going to drive that process?
Well, I think we talk about multi-stakeholder, and this is one place where multi-stakeholderism is extremely important. And that means states, through the intergovernmental system, the United Nations and its various agencies, including specialized agencies, including UNESCO, the Human Rights Council, for example, and so on. But it also means spaces where civil society, the users, can participate very actively. And of course, it means space where the digital platforms, the companies, the digital companies have to come in. So I don't think there's an easy existing forum today that will say, yeah, that's the way, and let's just do it. There isn't one. Digital technology has brought a lot of challenges. We are talking about freedom of expression, but digital technology sector has also brought challenges for multilateralism. And the way we have to cooperate, because by its very nature, this industry is a cross-border industry. On the other hand, rules are made within national territories by governments, or they come together and agree on certain rules on how to behave on the international level. And here there's a challenge. Yes, it's international, but it also includes corporate as well as states. It includes civil society, ordinary people. So there are many, many ways in which we have to do it. Let me go back to something on regulation, since we're talking about regulation, and that is, I think we need smart regulation. And smart regulation by the states, whether through intergovernmental process, hopefully through an intergovernmental process that sets the framework that then gets translated to the national level. Smart regulation means not interfering with content, but making sure that companies are transparent in terms of their policies. The content moderation policies we're talking about, who knows what those policies are? It's not very clear for the platforms. They play against it. Transparency. The second issue, of course, is about consistency. How much are they actually investing in local contexts in other parts of the world and so on to produce the same results in Ukraine, in Ethiopia as in Ukraine, right? And then we come also to due process remedies. We come to human rights impact assessment and risk assessment that companies have to do. Are they doing it? And if they're doing it, are they making those results public so that they can be held accountable to it? They are not. We hear whistleblowers all the time. So here, and those are the areas where I think regulation should be focusing on, because how they behave is extremely important. And we see, for example, in the European context, something is happening, rather than what. The what is already set out in human rights very clearly, and we have to be very careful that we don't go beyond it and make companies are speech police, as my predecessor actually used the term.
Okay. Sorry to cut you, Special Rapporteur, but I would like to get onto the floor now. I'm going to start with, I'm going to be a little bit biased and start with the media. Okay, we've got a hand up there. Please do introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Nicola Frank, and I represent the European Broadcasting Union, the Association of Public Media Organizations. I have 3 points actually on the actual guidelines, and we appreciate that the new version of the guidelines has introduced a number of improvements, and notably the clear obligation for states to promote and guarantee freedom of expression and the right to access information and to refrain, very importantly, from censoring legitimate content. But we believe that a similar clear provision for the platforms is missing. There should be a similar provision for this as well. Digital platforms, as we know, constitute powerful gatekeepers between media and their audiences. They decide who can speak, which ideas get heard, and most importantly, which ideas get traction. So to fulfill their distinctive social and democratic role, media services must be able to reach audiences without arbitrary or unjustified interferences, neither from governments nor from private companies. The guidelines should contain specific media protections against interference by the platforms. Then the third point, availability of accurate and reliable information in the public sphere presupposes access to a pluralistic media offer on digital platforms. Content moderation and curation mechanisms of the platforms cannot replace the editorial decisions made by media services in accordance with journalistic standards. It is crucial that a diversified media offer is not only available on digital platforms, but prominently placed to enable users to discover a plurality of media content and services. Discoverability of media services should be guaranteed by the platforms. So it's really 3 points. Platforms have to, there needs to be a provision that platforms promote and guarantee freedom of expression. We need media-specific protection and discoverability of these services. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's try and keep those comments as short and sweet as possible, because time is not on our side. I would like to call on the private sector. Anyone from the private sector that would like to share their views, their observation at this point in time? If not, I can always move on to the next group. Can I move on to the public sector? Any views from the, oh yes, over there. Let's hear your views, introduction and your views.
Thank you so much. I'm Jessica Cupellini from the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think that this overall issue has to be addressed with the multidimensional approach, in the sense that we totally agree that we need to co-regulate the digital space. It's not just a task from member states. It should be done together between member states and platforms. But the other strategy is also to give users, citizens, the digital skills to navigate internet in a secure way, in the sense that here I sense that we are looking at curing the disease but not preventing it. The ultimate goal should be to create a society which is resilient to disinformation. I mean, we have to give people the tools to themselves decide what is, I mean, to learn what is the misinformation, what is disinformation, what is harmful content, not to spread it, because many times it's ourselves to spread harmful content or disinformation content because we don't know that it is harmful or disinformative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Academia? Academia? Okay, yes, over there, please do introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Michael Karnikolas. I'm the Executive Director of the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law and Policy. It's a new research collaboration between the UCLA School of Law and the School of Engineering. We've been hearing a lot of references over the course of the day to human rights. We now have 3 of the world's leading experts on human rights who I hear expressing serious concerns about these guidelines. I want to thank the panelists for expressing these concerns. I know that many in the human rights community and civil society share these concerns. So my question is, how do we ensure that these concerns are reflected in the UNESCO process and the UNESCO outcomes, especially given all that we've heard about multi-stakeholderism and inclusion of perspectives? Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'll come back to you. Let me just, let's move on to the technical community. If not, I can, you want to go there, tech community?
Yes, so the technical community is not just the platforms. The technical community is also many dozens of researchers at universities and small startups that are trying to work with the platforms to deliver services directly to populations. We believe we have tools for evaluating the quality of content that flows through these different internet channels, and those measurements are probably needed in order to regulate the quality of information. So we're out here. Please invite us up on the stage next year.
There you had it, UNESCO. Invite the technical community to the stage next year. I want to do this. I want to go to our online moderator and then get to hear the views online. And then once we are done, we'll probably just answer those questions and then come back to your questions and observations again. Then we'll give you another opportunity. Can we go to our online moderator just to hear what are the views online before we answer those questions with the panels?
Thank you very much. And once again, we want to thank you all for engaging in this consultative process through our online platform. So we received one interesting comment from the platform, which reads, digital platforms should be responsible for developing the tools and capabilities to detect harmful content as prescribed in international agreement, set out in international standards. This monitoring capability, including how and what is targeted, should be verified by a regulatory authority. The violations should be acted upon by the regulatory authorities as legislated by each jurisdiction. And to specify, this was a comment from an electoral commission. And thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Where do I start? Mr. Villarreal, let me start with you. Those questions that were raised, what is your view on the question, specifically on the question that was raised about the digital companies playing as gatekeepers, that interference from the social media platforms? What is your view in terms of that? Are they really interfering as it was put? And what do we do about that when someone interferes with my freedom of expression, when I'm expressing something?
I mean, the multi-stakeholder dialogue also has to take into account the differential responsibilities. And for sure, the platforms that concentrate a lot of content, a lot of decisions, I mean, the paths and the highways of our public deliberation, they do not have like a single or a simple responsibility. And I also miss in this scenario, I mean, during the morning, more thoughts, I mean, from their side. You were just asking if the private sector or the main platforms do have a comment on this, and I miss that, and I encourage them to participate. I think we have to balance a couple of things. The first one is, as we are concerned for recent events, elections integrity, democracy integrity, pluralism, marginalized people, and we have a lot of examples, some of them in the region I come from. So we have to tackle for the future, I mean, in 90 elections in the next year, we have to tackle, we have to take lessons learned from there. And that includes some kind of responsibility of the biggest platforms that where the information flows. But then we also have to protect something that is not as highlighted as it should, and is the added value of an interconnection. I mean, voices that used to have a lower volume for their speech now have new platforms and new access and new connections. So we have to balance between these two, I mean, the highly risk of democracy and the protection of ordinary citizens. And that's where let me place again, we have to talk also to the behavior of our leaderships, because they are not only keepers of ideas that are spread in the platforms, they are also examples of behavior. And if they, in their controversies, cannot reach solutions, good paths for a better democracy, then we should not put all the responsibility in the other actors. Which are the other actors? The platforms, they do have a responsibility, and most of the multilateral scenarios are discussing it. And secondly, we have to protect ordinary people. Let's think about the impacts of any global guide or regulation in the ordinary citizen, not only democracy. I mean, I miss in this panel also the three-part test. I miss the legitimate goals, I mean, the legitimate rights and values that allows the restriction of freedom of expression. I mean, we are not starting now the conversation about how to limit freedom of expression. We have a background, and we have to take that, I mean, we have to start by recognizing what has been done by international courts, and we have to call tech platforms to this conversation.
I'm not infringing upon your freedom of expression by limiting you to say what you need to say, but time is. So let me move on to Ms. Ribeiro to just perhaps on the interventions that came through. What are your thoughts?
I would like very much to, I'm sorry, I would like very much to refer to the process. The process matters. The process that was initiated by UNESCO, it's a very, very delicate, it's a very delicate issue, and so it's a process that, of course, is full of difficulties, and maybe this is the reason why we are here to discuss, and we are having so many specialists coming from different dimensions to contribute. This is difficult. The values they did not change. The goals did not change, but we are confronted with a new reality. We need a new approach to ensure the same values and the same goals. And this is the difficulty. We need to be systemic. We need to be multi-stakeholder. We need to be multi-layered, and this is important. We need to intervene at different levels. Global level, it's very important, but also national level and local level. And so that's the complexity of the issue. But who is going, you asked, but who is going to, in a way, to take care of this in the end, assuming that in the end of our common path, we will reach a global instrument, legal instrument. Okay, then there will be the bodies of the treaty. It will be a treaty with its bodies, with and all the different, it's a network of important special representatives, etc., of the UN system, and not only, and with the others that, in a way, will contribute to the healthy implementation of the system. It's very, very difficult. It's possible, and but I would also, again, to bring something that is, we have two options, I would say. One thing is to say, okay, to put ourselves in a more defensive way. It is the moment to defend ourselves from all the harmful impact of the new technologies, etc. The other approach is, okay, let's look at it as an incredible opportunity to, in a way, to have an healthier system, having a kind of, it's not just human rights, but it's also public interest, in the public sphere. So we have, are we in a defensive posture, or in the contrary, we want to take advantage of the overall challenges and to be more ambitious and say we need to have a kind of a plus in the international human rights law.
All right, Special Rapporteur Khan, over to you.
I think, well, what's very clear from what my colleagues have been saying and what we've heard today, we are in a very, very complex situation. Lots, multilateralism, multi-stakeholderism, or the different standards and so on. There are standards, but the standards are very broad. There are institutions. I mean, regulation, the guidelines are talking about institutions, but the capacity to have institutions, to run institutions, that is very limited in many countries or is manipulated. That's also coming clear from us. And then, of course, the concepts are very difficult. Disinformation, misinformation, there is no definition of what that is. It depends on who you are and from where you're coming as to whether something is disinformation or not disinformation, right? We know that. So getting into that very tricky field, I think we need time. We need to hear a lot of different perspectives. We need a lot of consultation to understand the problems. There are a lot of people here. We've heard the academia, the experts. There's a lot for us to listen and take on board. We've heard concerns from what we call legacy media about how these platforms will work for legacy media. So it has to be a very thoughtful, long process there. And I think we need to understand good practice as something different from principles and values. At the moment, I think a lot of that is all coming together. What is good practice, for example, in the European Union, the Digital Services Act, is just beginning. So in one of the most developed parts of the world, there is an experiment beginning on how to manage platforms. Where else has that experiment happened? Not very successfully anywhere else. So we're at a very, very early stage in the process, and my fear is that we should not, on the basis of limited evidence, suddenly make very important decisions. And when I say we, I mean the international community, I mean the member states and others. So there is time needed. At the same time, there are some immediate things that can be done. And we heard today Maria Ressa talking about it. Fact-checking, a lot more emphasis on independent, free, pluralistic media as playing a role in this context. We have to have more consultations with civil society, with the users. We need to understand the problems. I think we heard earlier a lot of very interesting experiences coming through. So I think what we're looking for is a more thoughtful, perhaps it will take a little bit of time, but sometimes it's useful to take that time, and engagement. I don't think the digital platforms, the digital companies are fully engaged in this process. They hold a lot of power. They are major actors. And is it just enough to say that states will go and impose rules on them? I think we heard influencers this morning, 44 million followers for them. So there's so much power out there in the companies, we have to bring them to the table, to the conversation in a much more structured and serious manner.
Okay, I think we can take, I think I'm allowed to take two more. There was someone from the government, someone on this side that had put up their hand. We can start with you, sir, and then with you, sir. I implore on you to give me just 1 minute of intervention. Then we can take it from there. Your intervention.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Mukelani Dimba. I am with the Information Commission, Information Regulator in South Africa. I'd like to start my intervention with where this discussion started off. Reference was made to the fact that companies must be required to adhere to human rights and human rights principles, which I very much agree with. Where I have a problem is what appears to be, this is being put as a recommendation. My question is, when are we going to stop framing this as a recommendation and actually requiring these expectations or these obligations to be codified in law. Let me just give an example. Let's look at freedom of information, for example. As far as I know, South Africa and a few other countries are the only countries where freedom of information is made applicable to the private sector. This has not been replicated anywhere else. Why is that the case? I think we need to begin to stop the tap dancing around making this applicable to the private sector and actually make a very clear demand in terms of legal provisions. Thank you.
All right, thank you. You can go ahead and clap for him.
Thank you.
All right, the gentleman over there.
Thank you.
I'll come to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
1 minute, please.
My name is Dr. Abdusalam Waiswa from the Uganda Communications Commission, the regulator of the converged media sector in Uganda. I'm very much happy for the efforts made by UNESCO and all stakeholders in putting together these guidelines. They provide a very clear guide that I'm sure will shape the future of governance and regulation of digital platforms. What I've seen from the discussion so far, though, is some bit of pessimism about the role of government and regulators in improving the regulation of digital platforms. What my proposal is that as we engage and work towards developing these guidelines, we need to get closer, the government players, parliamentarians, regulators, to convince them more about the role and potential of these guidelines in shaping good policies for improving media and digital platforms in our countries. Because at the end of the day, if we don't speak and bring the parliamentarians, governments on board at the earliest possible moment, we might lose them. And yet without them on board, we may not benefit much from these guidelines. They might remain on paper, and we may not derive the benefits that we want to derive out of them.
Thank you. We unfortunately are running out of time. I would have loved to continue engaging with each and everybody, but unfortunately we have run out of time. I would like to say that with what we have had here today, there seems still to be a lot to be done to get around these guidelines in order for us to see some regulations enacted and put in place. I hope that with this conference today, we can finally, over the 3 days, we can finally get a step closer to ensuring that those guidelines are shaped at least 80 to 90% of what we are looking for, so that people don't have the complaints that they have. Thank you so much for your inputs and your observation on this specific topic. Thank you. That has been our session. Thank you.